Okay, so we're holding. Okay, I made the choice that we're going to continue to study in order of the laws of Shabbos. There are some chapters maybe we should skip as being a little more difficult and also maybe not so clear for everyone how it would apply to their performance of Shabbos. But it's short enough that we could get through it in one or two classes and we'll move forward. So the finishing off of this chapter, the next chapter kind of deal with still identifying what it means to be a private domain, etc., and things we can do. And then we have the chapter after that about different clothing, which are a lot of important questions about what can be worn outside, what cannot be worn outside, different pins. We addressed the question of different clothing. Is everything something we can take with us in the outside, wearing a wristwatch on Shabbos, etc. But we're not there yet. Hey, Aaron. So let's continue. We're holding in 82, chapter 82, law 10. This is something that comes up all the time. Ha'isha medadida asbina. Let's say okay, so we're not talking about obviously in a place that's outside an Erev. So there's no Erev that would permit using a carriage to carry your child. And here we're going to address a question that some people don't try to manipulate a little bit the law. So if you're outside of an Erev and you don't have a carriage, so you can use a carriage, and you have a child that you're trying to take along with you, and the child that refuses to walk, or the child needs help walking. So what do? You can't pick up the child and carry them. Although you want to use the leniency of a chaynoi says that a live person is not being carried, that he or she carries themselves, so it's not considered carrying. The Alter Rebbe addresses this at the end. Sorry, the Kitzur addresses this at the end of the Sif. But what should a person do? So it says a Isha, just says a woman, not because it's woman versus man, but if the woman is the one who's taking the child. She may lead her child, obviously it doesn't make a difference if it's a boy or a girl, in a public domain. Even in a Reshus Harabim. It's not just talking about a Carmelist, but a Reshus Harabim. Again, we just to remind ourselves, a Carmelist is a rabbinic public domain, meaning it doesn't have the qualifications to make it a biblical, a daraisa public domain, but the rabbis consider it a public domain. So all the laws, which is, again, most of today is the outside space that we have is a Carmelist, especially let's say where Barbara is living in the island over there. There's definitely no Reshus Harabim. You have to have a certain wide streets with a certain amount of people. But nevertheless, even in a Reshus Harabim, a woman could take her child, even though it means the child is lead, but lead is also kind of the child is not walking properly, right? Doesn't walk on his or her own properly. So it says you have to be careful. You should not drag the child, like you're dragging the child along. That's not called walking. You're taking your child on a walk. We're not going to get into if that's a way to behave with your children in general, but if you need your children, if let's say your child sits down on the street and you want to get the child inside, you can't just drag the child inside. That's not called walking. You have to just literally help the child walk foot by foot, and supporting oneself. Visha means to support oneself on that foot until you put it down, and then you pick it up and you support yourself on the next foot. Literally helping the child right, left, right, left. Shenimsa turns out, what's the idea over here? At least the child is balancing him or herself on one leg at least. Not that you're dragging it. When you're dragging the child, if you let go, the child falls. At least there's some support that the child is contributing to this movement. So it's nishan al ragli achas, at least leaning on one foot. But if she's going to drag, or he, the father for that matter, the child with both its feet, so there's no support of the child's own feet, it's as if you're carrying the child. And then it's prohibited not just in the public domain, but even the Carmelists. Again, the Carmelists is the rabbinic public domain. sheyochel leilech b'raglav osir afilu b'karmelis. So to carry the child, even if he's mamish, to carry the child, I feel him who godel kokach sheyochel leilech b'raglav vaday means what about if the child is a child that if the child was not being stubborn? Let's say a kid could be 10, could be 20 years old, throwing a temper tantrum, sits down on the floor. Right? I'm not moving. The kid could walk, just decided not to walk. Or whatever the reason is, the child's not moving. So even though if the child wanted to, he can walk or she can walk, you're still to carry him. Also, you're not allowed to carry another person, even in the rabbinic public domain. Why? He says, "Sheloi omru hachaynoise es atzmai eleliftim mechatas." This that we say, the rule that carrying a live person, so the live person really carries him or herself. This is an expression in the Talmud, means achai noises atzmai. One of the we see that literally, if you hold a live person, it's easier to hold a live person than if you were to hold, unfortunately, a corpse. Someone passes away, they become very heavy. And that same person, if you're holding them while they're alive, they're lighter. Why? Because there's a rule. The person who's alive really carries themselves. You're not holding the full weight, even if the person has nothing to support themselves on. They're not on like one leg on the floor. If you literally take your child and put him on their shoulders, there's the concept of a live person. Kind of the weight is not totally on the person. That's just the way it is. So there's based on that, there's the idea that you're not obligated a chatas, a sacrifice, a sin sacrifice for violating the Shabbos if you carry someone on Shabbos. But the Kitzur says that only exempts you from the sacrifice. But still not permitted rabbinically to do it. So biblically, you haven't desecrated the Shabbos, but you're not allowed to carry someone. So if you're going to drag the child, that's so yes, you won't have to bring a sacrifice for violating the Shabbos, the chatas, the sin sacrifice, but it's still a shvus, it's still prohibited on Shabbos. Ubekarmelis is shvus the shvus, and even if you're going to say that 1 second, a karmelis, it itself is not really a public domain, it's only a rabbinic public domain. Nevertheless, a shvus the shvus is also prohibited in this case. You're not allowed to carry, even in a non-regular public domain, a child, even though you won't have it. 1 second, Aaron. You won't have it. You won't have to give a sacrifice, but still prohibited to do in Shabbos. I remember once in Seattle, I was walking in the street, and this person was before Seattle had an Erev, the people that were Shomer Shabbos, carrying a child on his shoulders, and he told me, he quoted what the kids Shulchan is saying right here. I'm not carrying, the kid carries himself. But he says clearly, that's only that you don't have to bring a sacrifice. But he says, and tzrichim lahaz l'rab, you have to tell people about this. Why? A lot of people make this mistake. And he quotes Shulchan Aruch Shalatanya, which is the Alter Rebbe, Siman Shin Ches, which is chapter 308, Sif Law 81, and he also says, look in Shuvas Akiva Eger Siman Chav Ches chapter. The response of Rabbi Akiva Eger is also an Achron who lived in the times a little bit after the Alter Rebbe in Siman in chapter 28. Yes, Aaron.
Okay. What if it's an adult, they want to go to shul, but they can't walk? And you got to do a wheelchair, or you have to help them by carrying them, but you in some way.
Again, it's a good question, but from the law in the beginning of the law is he's obviously describing that the kid is kind of not really walking. Like if you hold the kid's hands and you say right foot, left foot, right, there's a lot of support on you. But he says at least there should be 1 foot of support. If you have to drag or hold, so he says it's prohibited. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to carry someone. Now, obviously, if we're talking about a medical emergency, we're talking about taking someone that's in a situation that it's dangerous for the child to remain or the person to remain. But just to take a person to carry a person to synagogue, if there's no pikuach nefesh involved, it's not life-threatening or dangerous situation.
No, okay. Let me give you just example. There's a guy I know, and if he puts pressure on his legs, they'll crack. He has his bone disease, so he can't walk. He has to be in a wheelchair, but he is kind of Hasidic, so he really wants to go to shul.
Yeah, but
So I'm asking you.
if he lives in your area, Mr. Rabbi has an Erev.
Yeah, no. Well, he lives in Borough Park.
Borough Park doesn't have an Erev? Borough
No,
Park
they
has
do, but I'm not quite. But I know that I'm just giving you the example. But there's Noah Roof. I want to use him as the example for Noah Roof.
Again, if there's no eruv, you're not. I mean, you're violating the Shabbos. He says clearly it's a shvus to shvus. Even let's say Borough Park, Brooklyn is questionably a biblical public domain. We discussed this. Ocean Parkway. These are big streets. Eastern Parkway. So there's a lot of people who feel that there should never be an eruv in Brooklyn because it's such a large public domain. But let's talk about it. Let's say it was a Carmelis even. Carmelis again doesn't qualify as a biblical public domain, but it's considered rabbinically public domain. So in the case if it's not life threatening, then for to carry the person, if again today they've invented. We spoke about it, Barbara, before. We spoke about the Shabbos electric vehicles. They have vehicles like a kind of for people that are not mobile on their own to use. I see it in Yerushalayim being used, and it's made by I think the Hartman Institute that has it in a permissible way for Shabbos to use these kind of electric vehicles, but it's Shabbos permitted. It's allowed to be used. But just to carry a person, that's not an electric vehicle, and that's a problem. Yes, Barbara.
I was just going to ask if a person's on a wheelchair and there's no roof, to have them in the wheelchair and push them, that's the same as pushing a baby in a buggy, isn't it? You can use.
It is, but it's not allowed. The people when you see people pushing in a buggy, it's because they're in a eruv.
Right, that's what I mean. I mean, you couldn't push somebody in a wheelchair outside in a roof. If they're in a roof, then you could push it.
Yeah.
Well, you say to me that you have a roof. I believe in the roof, but I know half of a lot of the Syrians don't believe in the roof.
Okay, but then if there's an eruv up, and let's say the healthy members of the community don't use it, I'm quite certain that in certain situations the rabbi may say, in your situation you could rely on the eruv. No one's saying that the eruv makes it as if it doesn't exist. They're just saying they don't hold by the eruv, right? But if a person halachically, there's the eruv is a kosher eruv. So the question is, if you hold by it, if you want to use it, that's another question. And it could be the rabbi in the Syrian community would say, if a person is sick and needs to get to shul and wants to go to shul, in this case they should rely on the eruv. But if there is no eruv at all, nothing to rely on, it's a question of a public domain or a carmelist, to push an elevator in a wheelchair is not allowed. Again, unless it's in a situation where the person it's a medical emergency or something that has to be taken care of. Now, if there are situations where people have, when again we discussed it before about having Gentiles push children in a carriage on Shabbos, which when there's no eruv, we discussed that before, and we brought down what the rabbi of Crown Heights spoke about that. The same would apply, probably even more lenient when it comes to people in a wheelchair. I mean, a person in a wheelchair who wants to go to shul will be different than a child going to shul or going out to eat on Shabbos. Although there's shalom bayis and although there's simcha and all the things that applies to Shabbos. But I think that in a wheelchair would be maybe a little different having a Gentile push outside the eruv. But again, it comes to the same similar question. Okay, so in footnote number 21, he just quotes the source about the idea of a child. It's just like carrying him, which is forbidden. He quotes Masechtas Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos 128. It's footnote number 22. Carrying a child outright, even if he is big enough to walk by himself, is forbidden, even in a carmelis. Okay, so he says, again, and he says that people make this mistake. And it's prohibited to carry on Shabbos. It only applies to making a person not obligated to bring the sin sacrifice, but still a shvus is still prohibited to do on Shabbos. See also Bir Halacha, another commentary on the Halacha, the Magin Avram, the Chai Adam, and see also Rabbi Kiva Eger, which he quotes at the end. 23 is a sin offering is brought for unintentional desecration of the Shabbos, so you don't have to bring a sin offering, but still prohibited to do. Okay, let's continue. Again, I think I saw once, I was once walking with a rabbi, a very strong halachic authority here in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has an Eruv, right? He doesn't carry on the Eruv. And I remember this is years ago, mamish years ago. So it was, must have been, wow, it must have been, this is the Shabbos that my nephew was born. So we're talking about over 33 years ago. So he was walking on Shabbos with his daughter, one of his daughters, and so he was kind of like picking her up and moving her, picking her up and moving her. So she was always standing on her feet, and he wasn't walking with her, but he was like literally picking her up and moving with her. But I'm sure that one of the reasons he was doing that was so he wasn't dragging her, and he was just picking her up and moving her less within the 4 cubics. So he was within space, and there was an Arab, but she doesn't hold by the Arab. So kind of everything together, that's how that his daughter made it from the synagogue home. Okay, Amas Hamayim. If you have a stream of water, this is a question. You have places, anyone who lives in the north end of Seattle, there's a lot of streams that pass through people's gardens and houses. So what happens if a stream passes through your garden? Amas Hamayim, the Hariveris B'tech Chatzar goes through your garden. Also, the Malas Mayim, and you're not allowed to take from the stream out, and let's say you want to fill up for drinking water. You're not allowed to on Shabbos. So you're in your private domain. Let's say you have, I forget who it was, Howard told us about those bottles that have the filters or the straws and all that, right? So are you allowed to take the water out? So he says, let's just see the footnotes over here. So he says a stream that is 10 tefachim deep and 10 tefachim wide. So here he's explaining the dynamics of it. The dynamics is that if it has, again, 10 tefachim is about 30 inches wide and 30 inches deep. So it's a stream, but it's not a river, but there's a substantial amount of space in that stream. That the reason why he's saying about the 10 tefachim wide and deep is because then it's taking out of it's switching domains. The problem of it is, so what do they do? Today we have sinks. So in other times, so the laws, I don't know if he's going to get to it later, but the laws of Shabbos, what do you do if you live over a stream, or you live over a lake that you could drink out of? So you would have to make a kind of eruv in the water by making kind of fence, and it has to be you kind of privatize a certain square that allows for you to go into to take the water out. Otherwise, you're not allowed to take the water out from a stream, even though the stream itself is running 100% through your yard. Right? You could have a stream, you could have that both sides of the stream is part of your private yard, and you have a fence around it. But the stream itself, because it has the depth of 10 on 10, is its own domain, and you're taking from one domain into a private domain. Now, there are ways to deal with it. He doesn't go into discussing it. So 25, as he says, the stream passes through and does not stagnate in the yard as a pond. It means it's flowing water. So the water kind of is just passing through your space. It's not settling in your space. It is forbidden to draw water. So here he says why. Because such a stream is a carmelis. This is a carmelis within your in your private domain. And the yard is a private domain. If it does not flow out, of the yard, but collects as a pond, it is all in a private domain. See Sharat Sion for further details. Again, there's ways of dealing with it. There's what happens if you have your porch goes over you want to drink. So there's ways that they deal with it of making a heker, kind of privatizing that space. But the problem is that the waters itself has the law of a carmelis, and you're not allowed to take the water from a carmelis, which is a rabbinic public domain, into your yard, which is a private domain. Yes, Aaron?
What about a well on your property?
A well is collected water.
So that's okay then?
if it's a private well. Okay, yeah, people, I mean, there's even wells in a public domain. In the laws of Shabbos and Eruvin, what they would do is they would make these kind of these kind of corners around the well to privatize the space around the well to allow a person to go in and take out water. But that's because the water is stationary, it's not flowing. Because the river flows and the depth is 10 by 10, so that it's like having a groove in your yard that's not, and it doesn't belong to you. So it means a pond is, we don't say that a pond has to be less than 10 by 10. Even if the pond is a deep pond and a wide pond, but the water stays still, so it's all in private domain. But here, the very fact that the water doesn't stay in your space, it keeps on flowing through. So the water is not settled in your place. So you're taking something from out of your domain.
But where you live, you could actually drink that water?
I'd say no, in Seattle you wouldn't touch that water, but I'm just saying that. But
I mean, I had when I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, we had a creek. That water is dirty.
yeah, today we wouldn't drink out of any water. You have those, but like I said, let's say you have one of those things that Howard was
Life
talking about.
straws.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue. Lo yamad adam rishus hayachin. Okay, so things like this, liquids and fluids in your body is in stationary point A. If you're going to urinate, for instance, then you're taking liquid from point A to point B. So lo yamad adam rishus hayachin v'yashtan hayorek l'shus haram. You can't urinate or spit from a private domain into a public domain, or a carmelis, or to a rabbinic public domain. Or vice versa, to stand let's say you're standing on the street and you urinate into a private space, that's prohibited. And also from Rishus Rabim, a public domain to a rabbinic public domain. Or from a rabbinic public domain to a biblical public domain. You're not allowed to walk if you have. Now this can happen sometimes. You build up phlegm in your mouth. Okay, not to be too crude, but you build up phlegm in your mouth, and it's in your mouth. It's kind of separated already. It's not part of your body, so to say. So then it's as if you're carrying something through your mouth. 4 cubics in a public domain, you're not allowed to. You can't carry phlegm or spit in your mouth and walk into a private or to a public domain from a change domains. So there's and you have spit or phlegm in your mouth. So he says, if the saliva has already been moved from one place in your mouth to another, so it's kind of separated. Okay, a person doesn't have to totally cleanse themselves from any liquids. It doesn't say anywhere that if a person has to go to the bathroom, you can't continue to walk in a public domain because you're carrying the urine. That's obviously there's fluids in a person's body. But once the fluids kind of enter your mouth, you could move it from place to place in your mouth, that could happen, spit or phlegm. So then you cannot walk 4 cubics in a public domain. Okay, let's see the footnotes. 26, I believe, 27. So he says, okay, he quotes the source for that. The saliva has been moved from one place in your mouth to another. He says, since it's already it's ready to be spit out, it is considered as carrying. So says the Rashi in the Talmud Eruvin. The Bir halacha tends to be lenient in this halacha in a true carmelist. So the Bir halacha, which is one of the commentaries on the law, says that if you're not in a public domain itself, but you're in 100% what we would call the carmelist rabbinic domain, so then he's not so careful about carrying spit in your mouth, even if it's already been able to move from one place in your mouth to the next, kind of like this if you're carrying it, but it's still in your body, you haven't taken it out, so it's not the same thing. Let's finish the last law of this chapter. Okay, these are laws that if you were to learn them in the Rambam, or if you were to learn them in the Shulchan Aruch, these are major laws with a lot of details. He's just giving us, again, you have to remember what we're learning is the Kitzur, the short version of the law. So like the law of the river, of the stream passing through has a lot of details in it, but he just kind of gives us the short version Bottom line is, if there's a stream passing through your house that has X amount of, it's 10 tefachim by 10 tefachim, then you can't take the water out. Same thing as this final law over here deals with the law of, it's a question, right? Of drainage, storage, right? The sewers, when you flush your toilet, you're flushing water from a private domain to public domain, right? The liquids are flowing out through the drains into the sewer, right? So it says, "Mutter lishboich shoifchim bechotzer sheyesh boi arba amas al arba amas alpha pishiyos l'shus rab." Let's say you pour wastewater on your let's say your front yard, and then it's clearly going to continue to drip, to pass through out of your yard into the public domain. So you're literally moving the water from the private domain to public domain. As long as there's a 4x4 space, 4 amas, 4 arm lengths, like 12, what do we say, about 12 feet by 12 feet. So it considers as if it's already settled in the private domain of your front yard, and on its own it moved out to the public domain. And it's not as if it came from your koach, from your strength, that you put something out. You can't stand by your door and pour wastewater into the public domain, because then you're transferring the wastewater from the private to the public domain. But if you pour it out in your front yard, and there's enough space in your front yard by 4 amas by 4 amas, and it continues to travel out to the front to the storage, that's not a problem. Again, these are laws that are he says it in 4 lines. There's many details in the Rambam regarding this, but this is the basic idea of it. And based on this is how we flush the toilet, etc. Any questions before we move to the next chapter? Excellent. I don't have a lot of questions today. Okay, let's go to chapter 23. I was considering not to learn chapter 83, and skip to 84, but we're going to do it. Okay. Again, these are laws that again are brought down in detail, but this gets into the question of, is every location, every place able to be made an Eruv? Could you privatize any space? That's the basic question. And if I remember, I was walking with my brother-in-law once, Rabbi Farkash from Bellevue. Barbara may know who he is. That when I asked him if he's going to make an Eruv in Bellevue, he's saying one of the problems with Eruv is the parks in the Eruv. The park in the Eruv it's not so simple to privatize a park. And if the park is a certain amount of space, it breaks up the space of the Eruv. So this kind of tackles that subject, but this is usually kind of an idea where basically, let's say you were in a desert. Could you just square off a huge amount of space and say that this could you just, like the classic case in the Talmud is, could you just take a valley and turn it into a private domain? How many people have to be in the valley for it to be able to, if I lived alone in a valley, can I just, if I lived in Montana somewhere, and my property has tremendous acres and acres, right? I know all the Midwest, right? And can I just privatize all that space and then carry anywhere I want in my yard? I could walk for miles, you can have properties that are huge. It's private, it's your private property, right? You have a sign, private property, don't trespass. If I made an Eruv, a fence all the way around my property, is it all of a sudden an Eruv I could carry in it? Right? If I'm in Texas somewhere, there's huge lands where the cattle is feeding. Is that I just carry there? If I privatize that, if I put an Eruv up in that space, so it's not so simple. So it says like this: Hekev mechitz is the taltim socha. What does it mean to create partitions to privatize the place to be able to carry it, i.e., make an Eruv? Loi mahani, it doesn't help. Ela keshehukav ladira. You can't just privatize any space. You have to privatize it for living. That I'm making this a livable space. And it's part of my living space. What defines living space? If you build a house, you have a door. And outside that door, you put walls, you put separations. Like people have in a chutzner in the house, you have a yard in the house. You have a living space, and you're extending your living space. So even if the yard is very big, it's not a problem. It's a private domain. If you're private, if you're fencing in a space, not as part of your living space, you're just fencing off a space, a yard, a field that's not connected to living. You're going ganus pardes, like I said before. If you have a garden, or an orchard that has no connection to living space, it's private. You own it private. You have the right to put the partitions. Like you have the right to do it. You could do it. And there's plenty of places, literally, that you go out, not connected to living space, that has fences around. It's a kosher Erev. Can you carry them? The only reason you have the mechitzas is to protect your privacy. No one should go in there. No one should take things from there. Then it depends how big that space is. If it's not bigger than base saw, which we'll learn what that is in the next law, then you could fence it off. If it's too large of a space, then we'll learn how large that space is, and FYI, it's not so big. Is dinika karmelis? It's still a karmelis. Again, this is why when someone says when you quote the law, people say, "I don't keep the erev." This is not an erev is not specific. So again, we're learning the Kitzur. We're not going into the laws, all the details of erev. But again, if you were to live, I don't know, Barbara, you live in a more kind of a quiet place on the island. If you had a private place that wasn't connected to your house, and you fenced it off, and even you own it, it's not so simple. You could carry it. So he says in footnote number, he's not going to have so many details on this. Because again, it's not so applicable for people's knowledge. It's either you can or you can't. Now, if it's gardens and orchards, now he says in footnote number 1, Sir Bir Halacha 3581, on whether animal dwellings are considered dwellings. Let's say you have barns, a barn in a space, and you fence off the outside space for the horses or the cows. Is a barn considered a living space that changes the dynamics of this fenced off areas? So because you have to look into the Bir Halacha for that. In footnote number 2, he says, okay, he'll explain what is base saw. Number 3 is rabbinically, but midaraisa, it's a private domain. Shulchan Aruch. So here he quotes from the Alter Rebbe, that from the Baal Tanya, that this idea of that if it's just an orchard or field that has no living space, and it's larger than the amount of space that we're going to describe in a second, so it makes it a carmelis only rabbinically. But midaraisa, it's a private domain. I mean, midaraisa is a place that you could carry it biblically. Okay, and that could come into question if you're going to be lenient in certain situations. Now, he asks, how large is this space? This is it for us, for someone living in Brooklyn or in Manhattan, this is uncommon, but Manhattan also has Brooklyn they have these huge parks, right? But if you're living literally out there where you have these huge private properties that are not connected to your house, and you fenced it in, if you want to go camping, the question is also how many people have to live in that space to make it livable. If you just pitch a tent, let's say you have a private property in a fenced off area, and you pitch a tent in that area, and it's bigger than the size we're going to describe right now, and you say, well, it's my property, and I have a fence all around the property, but no one else lives there, and you're spending Shabbos there, it's not simple that you could carry there at all. In many cases, it's forbidden for you to carry as if you're in the public domain. So he says, Kamahu shir sasayim. Again, so this question comes into really, I shouldn't say it's not so applicable. It's applicable, again, if you go camping. It doesn't have to be your private domain. Let's say you go camping in, I don't know, Mount Rainier. You go camping in a place that's, maybe it's fenced off. What's the laws on Shabbos if you go camping? So he goes, Kamahu shir sasayim mishkan. We look at the tabernacle. Because the tabernacle was what's called the space, everything about Shabbos is built around the tabernacle. The tabernacle's, what's considered a malacha is if it was done in the tabernacle. How they carried things and how they did things was all in the tabernacle. So what is considered a chotzer, what's considered a space, is what the space of the tabernacle. And beyond that is a larger space. So what's the shear of Sasayim? The space of the courtyard of the tabernacle, which was how large? Mea Amma. So Mea Amma, again, Mea Amma would be 100 Ammas, which is, let's say, 150 feet. 150 feet is not large. Long, and 50 feet, which would be 50 Ammas, which is be, let's say, 75 feet wide. So if I'm correct, that an Amma is a foot and a half, 18 inches, right? So you would have it by 150 to 75. That's not huge. And if it's a square, it's not a rectangle. So So we lose from the length and we broaden the width. So it becomes 70 amas and 4 tvachim by 70 amas and 4 tvachim. So so again, if it's a square, it has to be 100 by 50. 100 amas by 50. If you're a square, so you lose from the length and you add to the width. Uba amas shalanu, it says in our amas, it is chamishim v'shalesh al chamishim v'shalesh ma'at yoser. I'm not sure what he means amas shalanu, and in footnote number 4, he also says the author's intent here is unclear. Whatever, but let's just use the space of 1.5 feet per amma. It could be a length of 150 by 75. If you're squaring it off, it would be close to 100 by 100, right? A little larger than that. What about if it's a round space? So again, in halacha, the question is, how do we look at it when you make a circle? Does the boxed in space have to be outside the circle or inside the circle? Which means that you would have more space for the parts, the circle, the rainbow parts that are outside the square. Does imhu amakim ogul or b'shar tzir or other shapes? Tzrichim gankin lachshiv kein shiala b'tishboiris meruba chameshes alafim amma. He goes, we're talking about it has to fit in 2 square 5,000 amos. So 150 by 75, 100 by 50 amos is basically square 5,000 square amos. So whatever it is, it's 5,000 square amos is the place that you could fence off. Beyond that, you can't fence it off. It doesn't help to fence it off. Okay, let's skip the parentheses. Let's say it's more. The length is more than double the width. Even if it's just by 1 amma more than double, because 100 by 50 it's double, right? As soon as you go out of the space of what's considered the tabernacle space, so even if, let's say, if it's more than double the length and the width, then again it's a problem. So anything outside of, let's just say 5,000 square amas, let's say 7,500 square feet, beyond that cannot be fenced off. It doesn't help if it's private property. It doesn't help if you put a fence. You still cannot carry in that space if it's not a livable space. Okay, let's do footnotes over here. 4. There's not a lot of footnotes in this because the author's intent here is not clear. Okay, 6 is, however, if the length of the area is more than twice its width, even if only by 1 amma, 6. He says, if it's less than 1 amma longer, it is valid. It has to be, means it can't, even if it's, let's say, 100.5 ammas by 50, it's not a problem. It has to be 101. 7, he says, then it's considered as required more than 2 saw of seed. He says, this is true only if the area is base sasayim. If it's less, you may carry there regardless of the length. Prima Gadim. So here he asked the question, what about, I don't have 150 feet by 75 feet. I have 50 feet by 20 feet. So 50 feet by 20 feet is much longer than the length is more than double the width. But it doesn't have 5,000 square feet in it, or 7,500 square feet. Is that a problem? Because it said that it has to be like the layout of the Mishkan, where the Mishkan, the length was double the width. So if the length is not double if the length is more than double the width, but smaller than 100 by 50, which would be 5,000 square amas. So then he quotes the different various halachic authorities that says it's not a problem. It's if it's less, basically if it's less than 5,000 square amas, then it's not a problem. Okay. So this is true only if the area is based on time. If it doesn't, the only problem based on this is, I mean, I don't want to ask so many questions on a complicated law, but then the problem is not because it's bigger than the Mishnah. Then the problem is because it's more than 5,000, than 7,500 square amas. But let's just put a pin on that. Okay. Let's just try to get a basic idea of these laws. Again, because it does apply anytime you're in the outback, if you're outside of a regular city. The difference is that if you're in a city, there's livable space. It's very hard to find yard space that's not part of livable space. But again, there's plenty of scenarios outside of city. And like I said, my brother says that parks do create this problem. So Makim Shemukav Shalayim L'Shem Dira. Okay, let's say we have a space, private property, less than 5,000 square amas, that's been enclosed. So there's an Eruv put up there or fence. So it says that you're allowed to carry it. Okay, because we said you're allowed to. If from that place there's a yard, a private chatzar, a private courtyard. So what would be, I don't know how you would call it in English. He says, so if you have a space of base saw fenced in that you're allowed to carry, and if there's a courtyard next to it. So the courtyard is a chatzar is different than the orchard. Let's say you have a house, in front of the house is the courtyard, and then there's this orchard, all private, owned by you. So the courtyard is the fenced-in space is less than 5,000 square amas, so it's private and you can carry it. Now you have a chutzner next to it. It's also your private domain. Can I just carry from my courtyard to my orchard, right? So then he says, it's not transferring domains. It's all within private domain. If you have, let's say, things that were over Shabbos in the orchard, you want to bring it into the courtyard or vice versa, kalim, movable objects, so you're allowed to move it. But you can't take things, this is where it gets complicated. Private domain, the laws of Eruv is not so simple, even if it's a private domain. So let's say I want to sit and have a picnic, walk through my house to my courtyard, to my orchard and sit down under a tree and have a picnic. I'm going to take a basket of food. So is that you're not allowed to? The house, although it's all private domain, private property, but from the house, things that are in the house to go into the chutzner, it's not always so simple. It's going to the laws of Eruvin. It's even though it's all private, but it's not one domain with the house. The vessels that are in the orchard, that's been fenced off halachically, and it's okay. It's not too large. You can't bring it from the orchard into the house. And things in the house, like I said, your picnic. So again, you can't just. A person may think it's all private domain. I have a huge yard, and my yard goes into my orchard, and it's all privatized. Can I just take my challah, my sandwich, and walk into my orchard and sit down? It's not so simple. So again, this is where, if you want to look at it, like the case of a park. Right, so you have your house. Let's say you have a house that has a yard that goes into a public private domain. Let's say you live in a if you live in a fenced off area, let's say a golf club, right? There's a place in the North End in Seattle called, I forget what it's called, the golf club over there. So a lot of the houses have a house, private yard, means the people from who belong to the general courtyard can't go into your private house because it's your private yard. You can't just set up a barbecue in there. It's your private yard, but it goes right into the public yard. It's not so simple to take things from your house and go out to the public yard. That's why people, when you say, again, people say we don't hold by the air, this is where things get complicated. Because even though it's all a private domain, so then the question is, can I take things from my house and just carry it anywhere I want throughout the area? Okay, so let's, he's not going to even bother with footnotes on this. You're just going to let it sit as is. Let's do one or two more laws and leave for questions. How many laws is there in this? Oh, I'm going to actually try to finish the paragraph, the parak. He says, "Mokim shukum shalei l'shem dira." if a place was surrounded, but it's not for livable space. Again, a golf course that people live in the golf course, right? There's like, again, the houses on the outside perimeter, and then or sometimes in and out, and then there's a big fence, it's privatized. But it's a big space, it's not livable space. So if the question is, so you're allowed to, he says you're allowed to fence it off. It's less than 5,000 square hours of non-livable space, but it's not all considered your chutzner, your private yard. So you could carry things within, let's say, the golf course into your yard, but you can't bring it into your house, or vice versa. So now he says, "Makom shehukiv shalai l'shem dira." If you again have a surrounded space, but it's not for living, it's an orchard. And let's say you first build a fence around a big space, and then you put up a house or a livable space. Or you open up now, then now you're kind of connecting your house to the space, so it's kind of an extension of your house versus just being a closed off private domain. How do I now turn it into a place that's been surrounded? It means if you create the Erev before you create the livable space, that's the question. So the Erev is around the whole place, which basically means if I let's say I have enough, because in the laws of how it works in an Erev in these places is, let's say 3 people live. If 3 families set up a tent in this closed off space, that's basically enough people to make it a livable space. But let's say you come there on Friday, you have a fenced off area that you own, private property. No one lives there. It's been fenced off before, no one lives there. And now you decided to set up camp there. So the Erev came before the livable space. You didn't privatize a livable space. You privatized an orchard, and now you want to live in it. So what do you do? Matakanta, how do you make it into an Erev that's been created to close off a livable space? Lasses mukif dir, that should be that it was created, the Erev was created as an Erev for livable space. So you can't just, again, if you were to go into a private area that's been fenced off, and you move in enough people to make it, again, you bring in a 4, I think it has to be 3 people. You bring 3 tents, 3 people, you set up camp. So you're saying, well, it's a private property. It's been fenced off, even though it's more than 5,000 square hours, it's been fenced off, fine, and now it's livable space. So it's fenced off livable space, but it wasn't fenced off to make livable space. You made a livable space in a fenced off area. So you can't, he says, what do you do? So you can't just like make a abracadabra. You have to yifritz machitzas makom yasramas. You have to break the fence more than 10 arm lengths wide. So you're basically breaking the hekef. Let's say you have a very large space. So 10 amas is not so big. You take down 10 amas of the fence. And then it's chashuvas kepesach. You can have a pierce because up to 10 amas it would be a door in the fence. Then you haven't changed anything. To make a door in the fence, you haven't changed anything. But if you make it wider than 10 amas, then you broke the surrounding space. It's a pierce. It's a breakthrough. When ispatel mechitzas, now the mechitzas no longer are kosher for an eruv, and when you put it back up, avachach yigderois, again, it doesn't have to be so dramatic as a fence. You can have the sticks and strings as well. Let's say you have sticks and strings around the private domain, and now you want to set up a camp. You cut the rope by more than 10 amas and put it back up, and rope it again, and then you roped around the living space. Then it's considered a place that's been surrounded. First comes the livable space, then you've surrounded the livable space. Are there any questions? Okay, I think we're going to just do the footnotes on this and maybe open to questions. We'll have to finish this chapter next week and go into the chapter in the middle of the class. Okay, if you fenced around the space with partitions, from the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, it seems that this holds true even if you fence the area with intention to build or open up the house. Meaning, let's say let's say the builders build the fence before the house, but you really have intention to build the house. It wasn't like you fenced it off as a private as an orchard and decided to set up a tent, like I gave an example. You literally fenced off a space that you plan on putting your house there, but you didn't build the house yet. You put the fence up before the house. So if he says from the Kitzur, it seems that this is true even if you fenced in a place that you intended to make livable space. The Pri Megadim and Shulchan Aruch Harav support this view, and he says that the Pri Megadim, which is one of the main authorities in halacha, and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch agree with the Kitzur that that's considered a fenced-in, non-livable space, even if your intention is to make it livable after you put up the fence. But the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim, tends to be makel. He's more lenient that if your intention of this fenced-off space is to make it eventually into a livable space, then it's not the same thing. The Shar HaTziyun quotes Rishonim and Achronim to the effect. So there's different views about this. If you fence off a face, an intended livable space, before you make it an actual livable space. Footnote number 9 is the Mishnah Brura. He quotes for other methods, which is other ways and then just breaking more than 10 amas. And then you repair the fence, or you can make a tzuras HaPesach. There's another way to do it is he says, but if it's more than that, is considered a break whereby the partition will be nullified. After that, if you repair the fence, it will be considered a fenced around dwelling place. Or you can make it tzuras HaPesach. You can make before he said it, you can't make it tzuras HaPesach. All right, we'll leave that number 10 open. Any questions on this? Or do you guys want to try to finish the chapter? All right, let's just go further. We have 10 minutes. Let's say you have a large space. It's more than 5,000 square meters. But not the ba'ilanis. And I put in trees. I feel a muruba. I put a lot of trees in it. So if let's say you fenced off a livable space, very large yard, and then I put a whole bunch of trees in it, kind of making it like an orchard. So the trees don't make it a non-livable space. That's part of what a person likes. A person likes to take part of their yard is to have shade. So this is part of the livable space. But let's say you have a very big yard. Let's say, again, this is applicable till today. You have a huge yard that's been fenced off as a livable space, and now you want to make it into your garden, where you're going to plant things. You're going to plant vegetation. You want to make a huge garden you're cutting off a big portion of it, turning it into a place that you want to plant your vegetables. Zaras Ba'Yisrael, you want to put seeds. If let's say you use most of your yard that's been fenced off for living to now be used as a garden for planting, even if it's not in one place, but most of the yard, all around the place, you have a little patch of vegetables over here, and a little patch of carrots over there. It's not organized. It's not like you cut off the whole northern section of it, which is a majority of the yard. Now that space is no longer a fenced off livable space, an extension of your house. It becomes a gina, a garden, of a planting garden. And now if it's too large, you can't carry it in Shabbos. So it means if you have a very big space and you turn it into a garden, as a majority of the place becomes a garden, so it's now considered a non-livable space. You can't live in the garden. It's your field that you grow things. But if it's not the whole yard, but it's just a small part of the yard. If the part that you're planting, let's say you have you have 100,000 square amas, let's say, of your livable yard, and it's an extension of your yard, but you cut off 15,000 of it for your field, for your growing vegetation. Then even though it's a large space, but it's not as large as the yard, it's a minority to the yard space. So the yard has been fenced off for living, so it's still a livable space, and you can carry in the whole area. It's still nullified to the garden, to the yard. Sorry. Let's say this again. It's if even if it's spread out, if it's a majority of the yard turns into a garden. Let's say it's only a minority part of the yard. If it's less than 5,000 square feet of the yard becomes a garden, then the garden is nullified to the yard, and it all has a din of a yard. Kehilchatah. But if your garden within the yard you've fenced off, even though it's a minority, but it itself is larger than 5,000 square amas, 7,500 square feet, is the place that is your garden, that you're planting things becomes like a public domain. And because there's no separate fence that separates the garden from the yard, so it's like open to an exposed space, and then turns the entire yard into a place that's not fenced off, and therefore you can no longer carry in the yard. So you have to be careful. If you make a very large garden in your yard, it nullifies the eruv of the yard, and now you can't carry anywhere. All right, we're going to do the footnotes on this. Footnote number 11, I think. Including non-fruit-bearing trees. The Maharsha says, if you planted, including non-fruit-bearing trees. Okay. 12 is vegetable seeds. Most poskim say that gardens planted for beauty and relaxation are like trees. So he quotes, it depends why you grow your garden. If you're growing your garden because you like to eat the vegetables out of your own garden, so then it's a garden that breaks questions. If it's a majority of the yard, it breaks the yard. But if you're just doing it as a hobby, to relax yourself, you don't need the vegetables, but that's just a way for a hobby for you to relax yourself. Then it's like trees. It's part of the beauty of the yard. It's not a garden on its own, so to say. Footnote number 13, he says, most poskim say that planting nullifies the status of dwellings only when the planting was done after the walls were put up. But if you put up the wall around an existing garden for dwelling purposes, the garden does not affect the status of the dwelling. That's a big deal. So let's say you first made your garden in your yard, even though it's a big size, and then you fenced off the whole area for living, so then the garden doesn't break. It means the garden, according to the way that he quotes these poskim, these halachic authorities, is the garden breaks the eruv. But if you make the eruv around the garden, and there's enough livable space, so then the garden doesn't have that effect. Number 14 is that if it is not compared to the courtyard and the whole area is regarded as a courtyard, it means if it's small, except that you may not carry vessels from the house to the garden. Okay, you no longer, because the courtyard the garden is still a private space. Which case is this? What are we talking about over here? Covered less than, and this area is less than 2,002 saw. It is no consequence compared to the courtyard, and the whole area is regarded as a courtyard. But you can't carry, he says, from the garden to the house. Okay, like we said before, even if it's fenced off, you can't carry. Right, let's just do one more law because we can finish this chapter. If you have a garden, a yard that's only 5,000 square feet, square amas, and you plant a little bit in it, we go after the majority. Let's say again, this law is the most practical law. Not everyone has such a big garden and yard like 7,000 square feet. But if you have a small yard, but you cut off, but most of it you plant as a garden, most of your yard you turn into a garden. I think I had a neighbor like that. So we go after the majority. If most of your yard turns into a garden, a vegetation garden, you can carry in there because it's smaller than a base saw. It becomes complicated. If you have a backyard and you turn the majority of your backyard into a garden, you can't just take things of your own house into the backyard. Because, and from the, sorry, you can take it into the backyard, into the yard part, but you can't carry it into the garden part. Because we said, even if it's all one Rosh Hashanah, you can't take it from the house to the garden. And therefore, if you don't separate the garden from the yard, so then the garden going into the garden breaks the separation of the yard, and the yard itself becomes prohibited. So again, just to put it in a nutshell, if you have a backyard, the majority of your backyard, it's smaller than 5,000 square feet, but your majority of it you're using as a garden, you have to fence off the garden separate from the yard to be permissible to carry in the yard. Otherwise, the yard is like has an opening to the garden, and that makes now the yard a place that you can carry. So if you want to carry from the house to the yard, so you could carry in the yard itself and the garden itself together because it's less than the space, but you can't carry from the house to the yard if the yard is open to the garden. So that's why you should have a fencing off the yard from the garden, so you can carry from your house to the yard. Okay, let's do the last footnote over here. He quotes the Shulchan Aruch. All right, I know these maybe we went fast and they're complicated laws, but are there any questions? Because some of these laws are actually quite practical. I mean, things that we have to deal with. All right. If there's no questions, we will end here. And next week start with chapter number 84. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.